Right, good morning everyone. It's really nice to be part of obviously the celebration of the AIC and as someone who's been around for some time, nice to hear so much about the history before I joined the Institute. Although I was a little concerned to hear last night over dinner that the average time, or there seems to be a bit of a pattern of people leaving after 17 years. And as I celebrate my 17th anniversary in about 2 months, I'm a little worried what Rick has in store for me and if there's an unofficial policy that I'm about to find out. So this may be a bit of a recruitment or an advertisement for looking for future opportunities, but we will see. And I'm really pleased to be kicking off this session now, where we have the opportunity to share with you highlights from what I think is some really amazing current AIC research. One of the things that I think will become apparent during this session is the significant focus that our current research has on the online environment. This cuts across teams, but it's increasingly evident within the work of the team that I manage, the Serious Organised Crime, Cybercrime and Radicalisation Research Program. So in our radicalisation research, led by Tim Cubitt, who's here today, there's a heavy emphasis on the role of the internet in facilitating radicalisation, particularly in terms of exposure to fringe and radical content online. And we have a growing body of cybercrime research led by Isabella Vos, also here today, which is the focus of my presentation today. Now, it would be remiss of me not to reflect on the fact that AIC research into online crime stretches back at least 25 years to the work of Russell Smith, who we've just heard from, Peter Grabowski and others. The earliest reference to cybercrime in Russell's History of the AIC, which I'll take as gospel, refers to these publications published back in 1998. But of course, the world has changed rapidly since this early work. When Peter and Russell were writing about online crime and the emergence of cybercrime, just 16% of Australian households had access to the internet. That's not to mention all the other societal and technological changes that have happened since then, which create new opportunities for criminal actors. Cybercrime is far from an emerging threat now, or an emerging crime problem. It's grown rapidly and become one of the biggest threats to the safety and security of individuals, businesses and government. Now, we often see the terms cybercrime and cybersecurity used interchangeably or in the same breath, but these are of course different things. While cybersecurity is part of the solution to cybercrime, there is an important human element. There are technological solutions to some cybercrime problems, but there is a human factor which cannot be addressed by what's inside the black box with blinking lights. And when we refer to the human factor, we're referring to offenders who exploit digital technologies to commit offences. We're referring to the victims who are vulnerable to exploitation and who are impacted by cybercrime. And we're referring to the institutional responses, whether that be by financial institutions, police or some other entity. Researching this human factor can help us to better understand how and why offenders act the way they do, why people might fall victim, for example, to online scams, despite the wealth of information that's available on how to prevent or protect yourself online, and why institutions may not take the steps to prevent or respond to cybercrime in the ways in which we might expect them to. Which leads me to the Australian Cybercrime Survey and a body of AIC research that aims to really advance our understanding of the human factor in cybercrime. We developed the survey in response to an identified gap on cybercrimes. We didn't have a single source of data that measured different forms of cybercrime, that could accurately capture the dark figure of underreported cybercrime, which measured the impact of cybercrime, or which could provide sufficient detail to help guide our prevention efforts. At least not a data source which was repeated over time, which of course is what we intend to do with the Australian Cybercrime Survey. We piloted it back in 2021 before conducting the inaugural Australian Cybercrime Survey earlier this year. And there are several components to the survey. First, there's the core survey, which aims to measure cybercrime victimisation. This is completed by a minimum of 10,000 respondents. Modelled on the Drug Use Monitoring in Australia program, which some of the people in this room will be familiar with, we have a number of rotating addenda, which allow us, or a short questionnaire is completed by a subgroup of respondents to the survey, and which allow us to focus on specific topics of interest, things that are contemporary, which we might not want to ask about every year. We had an online interview component, a moderated interview, which allows us to deep dive on specific issues. This year it was ransomware and around the offender-victim interactions and decision-making. And finally, and I think perhaps most importantly, there's a longitudinal sample. We've recruited 3,000 respondents this year who will complete multiple waves of the survey. This allows us to measure repeat victimisation, but it actually also allows us to test rigorously the efficacy of certain interventions. The sampling method we used for the survey was designed to recruit people from around Australia who are broadly representative of the spread of the wider population. So, for example, the size of our sample in each state and territory reflects the proportion of population from each jurisdiction. In 2023, we had nearly 14,000 respondents, which includes the first wave of our longitudinal sample. Likewise, we wanted to make sure the sample was as representative as possible in terms of key population demographics. There was a high concordance between our sample and the wider Australian population in terms of age, gender, employment, education, whether the respondent was born overseas, and their level of remoteness. And our survey measures 4 overall or broad categories of cybercrime: online abuse and harassment, malware, identity crime and misuse, and online fraud and scams. We adopted a bottom-up approach to measuring these cybercrimes, meaning we ask about a whole host of indicators, types, indicators or symptoms of behaviour that fall within these broad categories. What this means is that we can produce reliable overall estimates of the extent of victimisation because it relies less on people being able to accurately classify what happened to them as an incident of cybercrime. Using this approach, in 2023, nearly 1 in 2 respondents said they'd experienced at least one type of cybercrime in the last 12 months. The most common was some form of online abuse and harassment. This was followed by malware and identity crime and misuse, and around 8% of respondents were a victim of online fraud or scams. This approach to measuring victimisation also allows us to measure more specific forms of cybercrime. In this example, we measured ransomware victimisation. We found that a lot of what appears to be ransomware to individuals and small businesses involves a threat of device interference or data loss, but no visible impact on the actual device. This in itself is quite important. I've also included comparisons from our pilot survey in 2021. In 2023, we observed an overall increase in victimisation. In our 2024 survey, which will be conducted mid-next year, we'll be able to produce similar estimates for other crime types. But I think the really important contribution, and I'll explain this shortly, the really important contribution of our survey is our ability to measure poly-victimisation, meaning the extent to which respondents experienced more than one type of cybercrime in the previous 12 months. This super Venn diagram, as we affectionately call it, looks far more complex than it is. It essentially breaks down the prevalence of victimisation according to the combination of cybercrimes reported by victims. 20% of respondents, nearly half of all victims, reported having experienced more than one type of cybercrime. 2.4% of respondents, the centre segment of this diagram, said they'd experienced all 4 types. Now, we can't tell from this wave of the survey whether these are connected incidents or whether these were repeat victims of cybercrime. But we know that people who experienced more than one type of cybercrime experienced more serious outcomes. And I'm going to return to this point shortly. Now, while it's true that it can be challenging to measure or establish whether there are links between different types of cybercrime or experienced by the same person, that isn't to say it's impossible. While it was not included within our overall measure of victimisation, we did measure data breaches. In the 12 months prior to the 2023 survey, 1/3 of respondents had their personal information exposed in a data breach. Optus and Medibank breaches accounted for the majority of these. Importantly, for those of you who might have been affected, the fieldwork actually was completed shortly before the Latitude data breach, which means this is certainly an underestimate of the actual scale of the problem. Even so, you can see when we compare the prevalence of data breaches in 2023 with our pilot study in 2021, there was nearly a 3-fold increase. Now, that's important because what we've shown is that data breaches increase the likelihood of other forms of cybercrime victimisation. Once we control for a whole host of other factors, the likelihood of falling victim to ID crime and misuse is 30% higher for someone whose information was exposed in a data breach. Their risk of online scams and fraud is nearly 17% higher. And the likelihood of being a victim of ransomware is 80% higher. Another really important feature of our survey is the ability to identify individuals who are at high risk of falling victim to cybercrime. For example, younger respondents, First Nation respondents, and people with a disability were far more likely to experience all forms of cybercrime. So too were people who owned or operated a small business. The risk of victimisation is also closely linked to online behaviour. We were able to identify a number of vulnerabilities, whether it related to certain platforms or certain online practices, which can be targeted for prevention. And this is what we found when we looked more closely at the correlates of profit-motivated cybercrime. Even after controlling for other factors, we're able to identify a number of online behaviours that increase the likelihood of victimisation. Frequent use of adult websites, online marketplaces, dating apps and gaming platforms were all associated with victimisation. So too was what we call risky online behaviour, sharing passwords, using free Wi-Fi for financial transactions and opening emails from unknown senders. If you do that, don't do it. Small businesses who transitioned to working from home during the pandemic were also more likely to fall victim. Now, this is not surprising given we know small businesses don't have the same capability or resources as larger organisations. At the same time, it wasn't just online behaviour that was important. People who experienced negative life events unrelated to falling victim to cybercrime but related to the pandemic were much more likely to be exploited. And this information can help shape the development of more targeted prevention efforts, especially for people who have already fallen victim and may be at risk of repeat victimisation. Now, of course, in order to support people from prevent people from becoming repeat victims, we need to know who has fallen victim to cybercrime. One of the benefits of a self-report survey is that we can measure cybercrime that isn't reported. We focus on police and Report Cyber. For those of you who aren't familiar, Report Cyber is our major online reporting platform to police. But we measure reporting to all sources. We showed that, unsurprisingly, the majority of cybercrime incidents go unreported to police or Report Cyber. And we can actually use this information to produce multipliers, which can be applied to recorded data to estimate how much cybercrime we're missing. So, for example, we can say there's at least 4.4 times as many online frauds and scams, at least, as were reported to police and Report Cyber in the 12 months covered by the survey. And given we know a cybercrime is reported to Report Cyber every 6 to 7 minutes, it gives a sense as to the potential unmet demand that exists in the community. Similar to victimisation, help-seeking varies for specific crime types, as well as different victims. This is exactly what we found when we analysed patterns of ransomware victimisation and help-seeking. There were differences between individual computer users and small to medium business operators in terms of the prevalence of ransomware, but also in terms of help-seeking behaviour. There are also differences in the actions taken, such as the payment of ransoms. Small businesses were, for example, much more likely to say their decision to pay ransom was based on the advice they'd received. Knowing that some victims, in this case small business owners, respond differently to falling victim can obviously help enormously when we're thinking about how best to respond to victims. Now, as well as measuring the outcome of the report in terms of what happens when someone reports to police or Report Cyber, we also measured victim satisfaction with the response by police. As you can see, for all types of cybercrime, the proportion of victims who were satisfied with the outcome was similar or slightly higher than the proportion who were dissatisfied. Now, we don't actually know how this compares to other crime types. This might be good or it might be terrible. We don't have a good benchmark. But we could compare the results with a survey we conducted back when we evaluated Acorn, which was the predecessor to Report Cyber. As you can see, there's been a fairly significant increase in satisfaction rates for victims of online abuse and harassment and fraud and scams. While we might still have some way to go, it suggests that there have been improvements in the response to cybercrime victims. And we also provide insight into why people don't report to police or Report Cyber. And the most common reasons can be broadly categorised into broadly summed into two categories. First, some victims didn't report because the incident was not serious enough. This is common with all research on reporting to police. There are important differences between those victims who did and did not report to police or Report Cyber in terms of the financial losses or the harm experienced from cybercrime. The second major category is actually the most important one, I think, and that's that a large proportion of victims didn't know how or where to report cybercrime. This is something that we're exploring further and which we can track over time, which is especially important given the investments which have been made in raising awareness on reporting options. Now, finally, we do measure the financial losses and recoveries experienced by victims, but I'm not going to talk about that. We also measure a whole host of harms experienced by cybercrime victims in a way that has not been done before. Practical impacts, such as the loss of confidence in using the internet, impact on a person's ability to communicate with friends and family, or problems accessing accounts or resources were the most common harm reported by cybercrime victims. This was followed by social impacts, such as the loss of trust, increased isolation, and relationship breakdown. Health impacts include mental or emotional distress, trouble sleeping, and deteriorating health. So the harms from cybercrime extend well beyond the immediate and direct financial losses. And some of Russell's early work was really seminal in highlighting this, and we've really tried to expand on that and systemise the way in which we record this information. Now, taken as a whole, more than half of victims of cybercrime were negatively impacted in some way. And from this, we can produce overall measures of the impact of cybercrime. Combining the prevalence of cybercrime and the harm from cybercrime, we can show that 1 in 4 respondents to the survey were negatively impacted, so 1 in 4 respondents, not victims, were negatively impacted by cybercrime in the 12 months prior to the survey. Now, this is important because it allows us to move beyond measuring cybercrime prevalence to being able to measure and track impact or harm over time. And I won't go into detail here, but we do the same for people who are also victims who are small to medium business owners. We ask them how their business was impacted by cybercrime, such as disruption of business functions, additional business expenses, impacts on reputation and revenue, the loss of information, impacts on staff, or legal or regulatory consequences. Now, building on this work, we've just finalised the development of our first attempt at a cybercrime harm index. And shout out to Isabella Vos, who's been working tirelessly to try and pull this thing together. And we use the information we collected in the 2023 survey. Now, harm indices, I'm not sure how many people will be familiar with it, but they're increasingly common and being developed for offence types that feature in police recorded crime data. And they try to measure the relative harm of different crimes, essentially. But given cybercrime is near impossible to measure using traditional police data, a cybercrime harm index has largely proved elusive until now. I won't have time, and I'm not going to bore you with the methodology that's used to calculate this harm index, but essentially it involves us taking information on the prevalence of harms for each cybercrime type, as well as the victim's assessment of the overall impact of that harms on them in the previous 12 months. And we use that to create an overall harm score for each type of cybercrime. These scores themselves are absolutely meaningless on their own, as far as an absolute measure. But what they allow us to measure is the relative harm of each type of cybercrime to one another. And we can apply these to victims and sum them across the different types of cybercrime they might have experienced. Now, it all sounds pretty abstract, so let me give you an example. We summed the harm score for each victim of cybercrime in 2023. And here I chart the cumulative distribution of harm among victims. As you move to the right of the chart, you can see what proportion of victims account for what proportion of the total harm from cybercrime. As you can see, 10% of victims accounted for around 33% of the total harm from cybercrime in the period covered by the survey. This is largely explained by repeat victims, the people who reported experienced multiple types of cybercrime in a 12-month period. And the obvious implication of this is if you can reduce overall harm from cybercrime by a much greater amount if you can identify and target these cohort of repeat victims. Now, to end, I want to briefly mention some of the work that we have in progress. The first, and I'm really excited about this project, is our intervention trial. So excited, nearly fell over. We are using our longitudinal sample to run an experiment to test the effectiveness of targeted prevention campaigns on changing people's online behaviour and likelihood of victimisation. We've partnered with eSafety and the AFP Joint Policing Cybercrime Coordination Centre, JPC3, on this trial, given they're the experts in developing prevention messages. There will be 3,000 respondents, there are 3,000 respondents that we've been selected for the trial, and they will be randomly allocated to one of 2 intervention groups and a control group. One intervention group will receive messages about preventing online abuse and harassment, and then the other intervention group will receive messages about preventing profit-motivated cybercrime, and the control group will get nothing at all. When we repeat the survey in 2024, we'll be able to measure whether these targeted prevention messages change people's online behaviour, reduce victimisation and repeat victimisation, and influence help-seeking behaviour. And because of the design, we'll be confident about our results. We'll conduct the second funded wave of the Australian Cybercrime Survey in around May 2024. We've already started planning for this, developing new questions and choosing topics for the next wave of the addenda, although they're not finalised, so just a shout out to anyone who might be interested in specific topics as part of the next survey. And obviously we'll be working closely with our partners over the next 6 months as we develop this. And finally, we have several other studies that draw on this year's survey and addenda, including a study of offender-victim interactions in ransomware incidents, the analysis of people's resilience to different forms of cybercrime, and a study of repeat cybercrime victimisation, which I look forward to sharing with you in the future. So thank you for the opportunity to speak with you about the AIC's cybercrime research. If you feel so inclined, you can scan that QR code with your phone, and it will take you to the more than 130 AIC publications on cybercrime. This includes the Cybercrime in Australia report and the ID Crime and Misuse in Australia reports, which were based on the Australian Cybercrime Survey. Thanks very much.